Welcome to Canada's Entrepreneur, where we talk to the entrepreneurs who are making it happen across Canada and deliver the news, trends, knowledge, and opinions from entrepreneurs and business influencers across the country. So David, welcome to Canada's Entrepreneur. In the intro, I didn't point out that you and I have known each other for way too many decades, but I think it would be really interesting just to let people know, your background and how you moved into under the radar. That would be. You've always been a little bit under the radar, but what got you into the musician side of it?
Well, thanks very much, Phil, for this opportunity. Delighted to be on with you, and nice to see you again as a very good example of a Canadian entrepreneur. Um, my background is journalism, graduate journalism, Carleton University, undergraduate political science, sociology, economics, University of what was University of Alberta at Calgary, subsequently became University of Calgary. Moved to Ottawa, did some freelance journalism work, worked for a period with the Canadian Film Institute as a documentary film reviewer. And anyway, fast forward one day, I saw this ad in the Globe and Mail Report on Business, and my goodness, it was back in the day when there were tons of box ads, and that's sort of what kept the Globe and Mail very much afloat. Anyway, it was summer of 1968, was worth a resume. I think stamps were 5 cents back then, as we are concerned these
I was
days
going to
with
say,
the
what's a stamp?
yeah,
Sorry.
with the health. Well, I'm concerned with the health of Canada Post. I'd like to see them succeed somehow and get everybody on side. Anyway, that being the case, in November I took a phone call, and it turned out to be corporate communications director of IBM Canada. I fell over in my chair. Again, it was a box number ad. There was no hint of any of the words of the day, like EDP. You'll remember that word.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, uh, there was no tech wording in the ad. Anyway, but it was an enticing ad, could have been anybody. He came to Ottawa. We had an interview. He said, "How would you like to come to Toronto for an interview to meet my boss and his boss and so on?" And basically, January of 1969, I was on board in the corporate communications department of IBM Canada. And they deliberately were not looking for a technology person. It really was, as we're living this world of AI and chat GPT, what goes around comes around. And at that point, computers were going to take everybody's job. That was what was going on in the marketplace. IBM's mantra was, one isn't going to be replaced by computers, but in fact, you're going to be displaced. So you better learn this stuff, get on the train before the train leaves the station. So uh, one of my many assignments was writing articles, customer success stories, not puff pieces, but factual pieces in the idiom of various industries, from meat packing to or the oil patch, from government to finance, and so on and so forth. Spent a few years at IBM Canada, subsequently wanted to work in an ad agency and was hired by Canadian iconic ad person, Jerry Goodis, who's since passed away. And he had a public relations division in his agency that was bleeding red ink. I figured, wow, what an opportunity, to succeed. And lucky to spend a couple of years there working on wonderful campaigns, from Speedy or a Somebody to the Greb Hush Puppy. It was just, and doing the PR for all of that stuff. Subsequently, on the 7th of May, 52 years ago, I incorporated a company called the Communications Group, Inc., which we subsequently rebranded over the years to TCGPR. And 52 years of history, lots of high-tech clients, lots of real estate clients, professional services, food service, hospitality, and so on. And that's sort of the groundwork up until roughly the beginning of COVID. And we still have clients. We're still in those arenas. in terms of the world of work. But one day took a call from a fellow who was looking to start a Jewish community site, and said, we'd like you to be one of our writers, but we're not going to solicit advertising, and we're not going to be paying anybody. It'll be a work of love. And I thought, interesting. So I said, would I have a free hand in what I want to write? And he said, sure. So I came back to him and said, um, I think there are tons of musicians who've kind of fallen out of sight, need to be remembered. There are entries in the Canadian Encyclopedia, but so many of them are one or two paragraphs. And I think what I'd like to do is write from an historic, not a music critique perspective, the stories of these musicians. And I will lay out an approach that basically will say they needed to be Canadian citizens, not necessarily born in Canada, Jewish, obviously, all genders, all genres. They could be individuals, could be groups, alive, dead, and need to have a national, kind of like the Globe and Mail. We need to have people who are living in markets other than Toronto and Montreal, major cities. And by the time I had written 15, which was now into the beginning of 2023, 15, 16, 17, I guess, somebody said, David, this is a book. And what would you call it? And I said, well, if it's a book, the notion of under the radar is the perspective from where I am coming from. And this is not, and I'm going to, and the artists that I've selected, it's not to put anyone down as being invisible, but the reality is so many of these artists have been forgotten, many alive, still alive, and I like them to be remembered. So that became the genesis of book one, and to date there are 3 volumes, and 2 more on the way.
It's very, very interesting. And I think, so, I mean, so this is really, this came out of COVID, if you like, and it's evolved. I mean, how many editions do you have now?
Well, there are 3 that are published, and they're all titled essentially Musicians Under the Radar. The first book has 30, and why 30? As we both know in our real worlds of work, 30 is the number that signifies the end of the story. Whether it's print, online, broadcast, what have you, it's signed off numerically or in Roman numerals. Well, for me, 30, that number became the beginning of a hobby, if you will. The second book, 36, in the Jewish religion, 36 is an important number. It means double life. And here I was on the second book, so I was doubly engaged. And then I thought, well, the third book, I'm going to sort of increase numbers by 6. And I sort of, I didn't stumble on the number 42 per se, because I can count. But when I did some research, I found out that in both Judaism and Christianity, the number 42 has some very significant meaning. The next book, actually, I'm going to go backwards. And at the end of this month, I hope to have a compendium of the jazz musicians. In total, I've done 148 chapters, i.e. 148 musicians. Yeah. And again, that with all of that criteria. But I've had many people say, would you consider a book by genre? And so for the heck of it, I sort of did a count. I hadn't thought of it. I did a count, and I discovered in the 108, there are 18 jazz musicians, from names you might know, like Mo Kaufman, to names you might not know, like Ori Dagan. You have to read the books to get that. But again, It's a reprint, if you will, but I think it's kind of a neat thing. And again, the number
Yeah,
18 goes back to life.
yeah. So obviously, I think probably lots of people have said to you, so you've done what, 30, 60, over 100, let's say, uh, chapters on musicians, Jewish musicians. What, who would be your top five?
Well, again, it depends.
It's terrible to say top five, but
Well,
the five that you
th-
found really interesting.
let me sort of come through the back door on that one. I found myself, I mean, a week doesn't go by that I don't get a couple of nomination suggestions from all sorts of people of
Hmm.
all ethnic backgrounds, of all religious backgrounds.
Hmm.
Again, it comes from people who are interested in history, interested in music. And my question would be, okay, Phil Bliss, can you name 3 to 5 Canadian Jewish musicians? And and that would be the same question I'd ask anyone. And almost invariably, the names that come up are Leonard Cohen,
Of course.
Geddy Lee, the
Mhm.
bass guitarist from Rush, and Drake. Drake's mother is Jewish, and that qualifies. And then there's this pregnant pause. Once in a while, I'd get Robbie Robertson of the band, but not a heck of a lot more. And again, what I've also learned, and that sort of reinforces the book of jazz musicians just picking one genre. And I may do subsequent ones on rock and so on and so forth, but what continually happens in terms of people's reactions is I didn't know. I didn't know Mark Jordan was Jewish, or I didn't know Mark Jordan was Canadian. Didn't he write all those tunes for Rod Stewart? Rhythm of the Rain and so on and so forth. I didn't know Zal Yanofsky was the guitarist with Love and Spoonful, and he was deported. He and one of his bandmates was deported from the United States for substance abuse many years ago. And I didn't know he came to Kingston, Ontario, and his daughter, he opened a restaurant called Chez Piggy. It's a fun place to go to if you're ever in Kingston. But there's sort of an example. Um, Yesterday, I stumbled on a pedal steel guitarist who was born in 1938, died in 2021, born in Montreal. He was hot stuff in Nashville. He moved to Nashville as in his mid 20s, early 30s,
Hmm.
and played with the Webb Pierces and the Jimmy Rogers and all that stuff. So I keep and this is what kind of fuels my engine. The
Hmm.
I didn't know that reaction from all kinds of people, and people go, she Maureen Forrester, you wrote about Maureen Forrester, operatic contralto. She's Jewish. Well, she had converted, married a musician. She became more Jewish than him in her conversion. It was her choice, wasn't necessarily his. But those keep coming up. So back to who are the top names? Well, it depends on the genre. There's a gal in my first book. Her name is Erica Goodman. She is ranked as the 50th most prominent harpist in the world.
Hmm.
Got me to thinking when I discovered that the other 49 must be brilliant because she's over the top. She's so good. Like, who does these rankings? So I asked her if, I mentioned, because she'd asked me, who are some of the other artists in the book that I'm in? And I
Hmm.
mentioned 2 or 3 names, musicians of other genres. And she wasn't really aware of them. I think a lot of musicians, you stay in your own lane. You're a classical musician, you do
Hmm.
folk music, you do rock. I mean, here's a guy, the bass guitarist is Steppenwolf. Name is Nick St. Nicholas. People would
Hmm.
say to me, David, that's not a Jewish name. I said, well,
Hmm.
so many musicians and so many people in the media over the years took pseudonyms. They took stage names. And his name was Nicholas Kastenbaum. He was a child of a Holocaust survivors, came to Toronto, lived in the west end of the city,
Hmm.
self-taught to play guitar, hooked up with a few bands. Ultimately, he becomes the bass guitarist of Steppenwolf. Who knew? Who knew?
So, how many of the musicians, as a result of this, have you met, interviewed, had had their feedback, and what have you got? Sort of, can you give people some gems from that, if you like?
Well, one of the most satisfying responses has come from families of musicians who have died.
Hmm.
Um, there's where people have said, you've helped create a family legacy for our family. There was a wonderful jazz musician by the name of Bernie Pilch. Bernie passed away a number of years ago, and I mean he was an in-demand horn player a musician rather in Toronto, and he and his wife had three children, each musicians, Rob, David, and Susan, um, and the three of them are over the moon because their dad, who was known, um, will not be forgotten in part because of this chapter. And if anybody listens to any of his music, same sort of thing. Sylvia Murphy, she was on she was a songstress, big on CBC in the 50s and the 60s. Same kind of reaction. Um, Oscar Marowitz, classical music composer. His daughter had sent me a text message and said, "We are ever so thankful that you're not letting my dad's memory disappear." Well, I didn't set about, Phil, to do that. It's just become a very fulfilling and happy byproduct of the result of my research and work.
Now you mentioned,
And let me just maybe add what when a book comes out, the musicians who are alive, and if they're in the greater Toronto area, I try to get together with them for a cup of coffee and kind of a rehash, and give them a book, sign the book, and I've made a lot of new friends as a result. And I say new friends basically because I've probably gleaned more about them and their families, or their parents, or whoever it was in their family, than I did on the first go around as I was preparing the material. So I've been able to build up connection, and it's a very the world of music in its lanes is a very, very tight community. Every guitarist knows every other guitarist, every horn player knows every other horn player, and others know others. But it's really just a lot of fun.
so that's why I'm just was curious in terms of the background, say Stephen Page or Robbie Robertson or whatever. Have you been able to meet them?
Well,
And
Robbie Robertson has passed
well,
away.
he's passed, yes, I'm
He's
aware.
yes, yes, yeah, yeah, as an example. But yeah, those that I've not, in so many cases, my interviews will be over the phone
Right,
because there are a lot of musicians in Nashville.
right.
There's a wonderful guy who's really an advocate for the music industry, and his name is Eddie Schwartz, and he's a
Hmm.
producer, he's a guitarist, he's a player, originally from Toronto, moved to Nashville, and he wrote a lot of stuff, but probably his most notable hit was for Pat Benatar, "Hit Me With Your Best Shot."
Right.
A very close friend of Eddie Schwartz's is a guy called Ben Mink, maybe a name you haven't heard of. Ben Mink has basically co-written almost everything that Katie Lang has recorded.
Yeah.
"Constant Craving," you'll know that tune,
Hmm. Yeah.
among others. And so I've been able, if Ben comes to Toronto, we find a way to grab a cup of coffee.
Hmm.
It's that sort of thing, or we'll send each other a text, or there'll be something
Hmm.
maybe in LinkedIn or email. Somehow the messaging and the contact continues, and and I'm not starstruck by any of this, let me tell you, because some of these musicians are absolutely huge stars. And my concern too with the phrase under the radar, I had thought on various occasions, will musician X be upset that I am pegging them as under the radar? Because they all have egos. We all have egos, but they have egos and they all think they're on top of the world. And here's a good example. Danny Marks. Danny Marks, you may know today, is the voice of blues and jazz on Jazz FM 91 that's in Toronto and goes worldwide. Danny was one of the co-founders of a rock group called Edward Bear, and you might remember the tune "You, Me, and Mexico," among others. Danny, it was the first thing that came out of his mouth as I was trying to cobble together his chapter, and he said, "David, at 19 I was a rock star. At 21 I was a has-been." And that's the path that so many musicians find themselves on. Some get out of it altogether. There's a wonderful jazz pianist, Ron Davis. He's a lawyer in Toronto with Fogler Rubinoff. Um, his parents insisted he go to university and work to get a degree because they weren't convinced that he could make a living as a musician. Well, we touched on the pandemic earlier, and right about that time, Ron, who was working part-time with Fogler's, decided he was going to pack in his jazz music career because all of his bookings went out the door, and literally, the future didn't look very bright. Family to feed, things to do, bills to pay. He is happy as a lawyer. And of course, I've asked the question, and it's also in the chapter. It was the way I concluded the piece. Are you ever going to come back? And what's the standard answer for those of us who like to come back and do different things? Never say never. And that's what Ron Davis said to me.
Is there any kind of theme about them in terms of similarities across the personas that you've covered, if you like?
That's a good question, Phil. I would say their belief in Judaism. Some are very, very religious, and many are not. And a standard sounds like ordinary, but a basic question that I ask everyone is, how has your religious beliefs impacted the creativity of the music that you write, sing, play, what have you? And as I say, there are some who are very much fueled by their religious beliefs, their upbringing as children. There's a fellow, for what will be volume 5, there's a punk rocker whose name is David Quinton. His name actually is David Alexander Steinberg. And he didn't at 17 into his mid-20s, didn't use the Steinberg name because he was looking for a cool sounding rock and roll name. And again, a punk rocker. But his dad is an internationally known cantorial music composer, recognized all over the world. So here's a young man who came from music when he left the womb, his mother's womb. Music was part of the package, but he became a punk rocker. And today he's an entertainment lawyer with
Which
dentists.
music? I guess the entertainment lawyer is kind of music as well,
Well, yeah, and he represents a number of players, and but again, music was so much part of his life. But the fact that his dad at one end was writing and composing religious music, and the son on the other end goes out and becomes a punk rocker.
And again, I was thinking, when this is Canada's Entrepreneur after all, um, and at least independent musicians are effectively entrepreneurs. I mean, they're selling their services or their lyrics or whatever to make a living. Um, is that kind of entrepreneurial approach been kind of obvious to you when you've been interviewing them?
Well, there's no question. Being a musician and looking for gigs uh, uh, is an ongoing process. It's like, you're always selling yourself. The curious thing is that so many of them, and here we are back into technology, they all have CDs that are gathering dust on shelves because there aren't, where do you get a CD player these days? And in the new model vehicles, there's no longer a CD player. But so they're always out hustling. They're always looking for work. But so many of them have other jobs because that's what pays the bills.
So it's
And
become a bit of a side hustle,
well, yeah. I mean, yeah.
unless you're lucky enough to make it your life kind of thing.
Well, and that's sort of been, I guess, part of the driver. I mean, for me, I can't tell you how many times over the years I'd heard, David, your firm uh, just worked with so many wonderful, wonderful organizations. I think you should write a book. So I always thought there was a public relations, um, obviously success and sometimes not so successful stories ready to be written. But this switch to music is kind of a natural one because my dad was an amateur musician. His youngest brother was a full-time clarinetist, a saxophonist at the O'Keefe Center for 26 years, which is very, very long tenure.
Yeah.
Our older son in Brooklyn is a full-time jazz percussion Afro-Cuban musician. He also teaches. He also teaches, and that helps pay some of
Hmm.
the bills as well. And that's just the nature of where it's going. But you see, at the end of the day, there's another commonality, and I touched on the Judaism issue, but every one of the musicians in the books they're all from immigrant families. And when immigrants come to Canada and have come to Canada over the years, um, the parents are looking for a better life for themselves, for their kids. They want them to be better educated. So the push to higher education is significant, as is learning a musical instrument, whether for personal joy or maybe to become a professional musician. And it doesn't matter what the ethnic background is of the individual. Um, that pattern has been the pattern for years. And if you will, the complexions, if we pick the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but if you look at the makeup, the complexion of the orchestra, the players have changed. It's gone maybe from one ethnic group to two or three, to all of a sudden it's a United Nations of
It's great.
individuals, you know, of very talented people.
Yeah. So, again, staying on the entrepreneurial side, I mean, the people that you met, were they happy because of their music?
Absolutely. Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. There's the people who become professional musicians all subscribe to the word passionate. There is an absolute passion, Phil, for what they do. And whether they're a harpist or they play a vibraphone or they're a drummer or they're a horn player or a singer or they just want to do composition, they really tend to pick their lane. And like jazz is going to be my thing or folk music is going to be my thing. There's in the first book, Under the Radar, 30 notable Canadian musicians. There's a group called the Travelers, the Canadian Travelers, and you'll maybe remember them from that tune, "This Land Is Your Land."
Yeah.
Um, the group actually was started by a fellow by the name of Jerry Gray, who was ultimately went on to become a dentist. And he partnered with a fellow by the name of Jerry Goodis, who went on to run an ad agency and for whom I worked. Fast forward all these years, Jerry Goodis had told me stories about the early days, but Jerry Gray's mother, was really quite upset when he decided, after he got his dentistry degree, that he was probably not going to be practicing dentistry. Why? Because he'd started this group and with connections to Pete Seeger and the Weavers and all of those folkies in the United States who were being targeted by Senator McCarthy in the 50s and the 60s. They were blacklisted. And Pete Seeger said to Jerry Gray at an event at a summer camp north of Toronto, I'm giving you two gifts. I'm giving you a banjo that I've been playing for a long time, and you're such a talented fellow. I'm giving you a song that we can no longer sing in America because our freedom is being challenged. Kind of like what's sort of happening a little bit today. And he said, none of us can sing This Land Is Your Land, if you will, the American version. So Canadianize it, make it your own, and good luck and God bless. And that's exactly what happened.
Interesting stories. I'm sure it's been a fun time interviewing all these people and it's like, in a way, it's sort of like what I do is interview entrepreneurs and hear their stories and their experiences, and it's extremely rewarding and interesting. Makes you get a lot of knowledge. David, just before we call it, can you give everybody the sort of the names of the editions that are out and where they can get them?
Well, the easiest way to get them is from Amazon. And there are currently 3 active titles, and there will be 2 more. The first one is Under the Radar, 30 Notable Canadian Jewish Musicians. The second book is Musicians Under the Radar, 36 Notable Canadian Jewish Performers. And the third book is also titled Musicians Under the Radar, 42 Notable Canadian Musicians. They're soft cover, easy reading, available in print, ebooks, Kindle, I guess, specifically, if people are still using Kindle. And the book, and we have a website, undertheradarbook.com. If one was to send me a message at undertheradarbook.com, I could find a way to get a copy into someone's hands. And it's the wheels just keep on turning.
David, great seeing you again. Thanks for coming on Canada's Entrepreneur. It's a little different, but it's definitely entrepreneurship, so that's really great.
Well, there you go. I'm still keeping my day job.
Okay.
Well, I'm having fun with my hobby.
Yeah.
There you go.
Great to see you.
Thanks for your time, Phil, and thanks for the opportunity. Be well.
Well, that was really interesting. We don't think of musicians as entrepreneurs, but of course they are. They take risks. They're passionate, as David said. Fantastic, interesting thing. And of course, David's an entrepreneur and with a passion for music and communications. Anyway, thanks for listening and viewing. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter on our website. And subscribe on YouTube as well, or any of the major podcast channels. Once again, thanks for listening to Canada's Entrepreneur, where you meet the entrepreneurs that drive Canada's economy. See you later. We talk to the entrepreneurs who are making it happen across Canada and deliver the news, trends, knowledge, and opinions from entrepreneurs and business influencers across the country.